Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to a different approach to the challenge of right-wing populist threat to democracy. Inglehart and Norris, Cultural Backlash, offer a different theoretical approach to the question of the rise of support for right-wing populism. Their approach involves the factors and dynamics that explain the creation of political identities, sets of values, moral and political frameworks over time. And they emphasize the importance of cohorts, or generations of people born at different points in time. Inglehart published an important book in 1971 called The Silent Revolution, in which he argued that there was a gradual shift in values and frameworks towards a higher level of social liberalism, higher levels of racial tolerance, pluralism, a concern for equality, environmental concerns, anti-war concerns. He refers to these as post-materialist values. They also, in this book, provide an account and an organized empirical political science account of what the response has been in many countries, including the United States, the response on the part of the electorate to these shifting kinds of political values and the shifting balance between more progressive and liberal social ideas versus more traditional and conservative ideas. Progressive politicians and activists emerge to mobilize the votes of citizens who have the liberal social values, but populists, xenophobes, traditionalists, and other conservative candidates and activists emerged to respond to the dissatisfaction of the cultural backlash population. And it's the cultural backlash theory that we'll be talking about. Electoral competition then ensues, leading to intensified ideological competition and struggle over the rules of electoral competition, voting rights, gerrymandering, as well as more concrete policy issues. The approach that Inglehart and Norris take differs from what we've seen in both Moody and Jest, in that both Moody and Jest take kind of a snapshot approach to the rise and fall of political parties and political movements. They are interested in the direct causes that lead to voter dissatisfaction, whereas Inglehart and Norris approach the topic in a more historically extended way, a long, slow shifting of values and attitudes, stimulating a counter-reaction from other citizens. And so their central ideas are the silent revolution, an emergence of more liberal social values through the generations from the 1950s and 60s to the present, and a cultural backlash which has responded to this shift. So here's a quote that kind of describes their theory, quoting from Cultural Backlash. The story of the cultural backlash can be broken down logically into a series of sequential steps involving 1. Long-term social structural changes in the living conditions and security which successive generations experienced during their formative years. 2. The way these developments led to the silent revolution in cultural values. 3. The conservative backlash and authoritarian reflex that this stimulated. 4. Medium-term economic conditions and rapid growth in social diversity accelerating the reaction. 5. How the conservative backlash drives voter support for authoritarian populist parties and leaders. 6. How votes translate into seats and thus government offices through electoral systems. And finally, 7. The broader consequences of this phenomenon, including for the stability of established democracies and hybrid regimes, for party competition and the issue agenda, and for the civic culture. This paragraph is worth thinking about very, very carefully and seriously. It's very compact and it describes multiple hypotheses. A couple of other quotes that I think are important, also from the Cultural Backlash book. Long-term social structural developments in post-industrial societies, growing prosperity, we're talking about the 1950s here, growing prosperity, rising access to college education, more egalitarian gender roles, and processes of urbanization led to the silent revolution in socially liberal and post-materialist values, which first became evident at the societal level in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Another important quote, "The first premise in our argument concerns the silent revolution in cultural values that occurred during the second half of the 20th century, transforming the cultures of post-industrial societies. More than 40 years ago, the silent revolution, authored by Inglehart, argued that the post-war era's unprecedentedly high levels of existential security led to an intergenerational value shift among Western publics." This is a hugely important point that they're making. They also talk about a tipping point as the value schemes were shifting for the population as the population aged and new cohorts came along. They argue that there is a phenomenon in politics which they refer to as tipping point, which I'll raise a few questions about when we discuss. But here's their description of tipping point. "Changes in the relative size of majority and minority groups can spark a decisive shift in collective attitudes and behaviors, catalyzing a reaction when a previously dominant group perceives that their core norms and beliefs are being overwhelmed by social tides and they are losing their hegemonic status. This provides an opportunity for political elites to respond to their cultural grievances." Think about the processes which Jest describes, the processes of what he refers to as political marginalization, and think also about the content of speeches by candidate Trump, President Trump, and his appeal to themes which specifically seem to be designed to respond to, quote, cultural grievances. Another quote from the book, "Subsequent chapters provide new evidence demonstrating how long-term, intergenerational, educational, and urbanization change have gradually shifted the balance between social liberals and social conservatives in Western societies, and how this in turn has triggered a cultural backlash among social conservatives with intolerant attitudes." So this theory is a theory of ideological change, a theory of change of values and political worldviews in a diverse population, diverse both ethnically, racially, and in terms of gender, but also diverse in terms of cohorts, when people were born, what their formational experiences were, whether they were born in the 1930s, the 1950s, or the 1980s. These authors have a theory for why social liberal attitudes would arise among younger people since the 1950s, and that is the list of characteristics I referred to in a previous slide. They also have a theory for why social conservative people, which happen to be the older cohorts, would be increasingly hostile to the rising tide of social liberal attitudes, and they have a tipping point theory of why these gradual processes shift into direct political antagonism and mobilization. And I would simply observe the tipping point idea is interesting, it's appealing, but it is questionable. We need to consider whether it's an accurate political observation, a causal mechanism or not. Malcolm Gladwell, the well-known writer, wrote a book called The Tipping Point, and others have considered the idea, but I'm not completely certain that I believe that it is a valid mechanism of social explanation. So we've got two diagrams here of the theoretical framework, the mechanisms which Inglehart and Norris are hypothesizing about how silent revolution leads in the context of the issues of the 1970s and 80s, including globalization, immigration, diversity, and ideological change, cultural change. The term now in use, the cancel movement. Well, that is a reactionary, a cultural backlash theory, which is rejecting the call for greater inclusiveness. So threats to social conservatives trigger an authoritarian reflex, and then we have political competition, and we've seen a lot of the results of that in prior parts of the course. This is a similar diagram, not exactly the same, it comes from the last chapter of the book, but social structural change leading to the silent revolution, or the shift of political and ideological framework for the youngest cohort, people born in, let's say, 1945 and later, followed by a silent revolution in socially liberal post-materialist values for these younger people, now late middle-aged people, boomers. The idea of the tipping point with cultural backlash and authoritarian reflexes coming into play in the 2000s, 2010s, 2020. The occasional effects of economic conditions and immigration flows, and this is what Moody and Jest have given primary attention to, these kind of instigating causes along the way, whereas Inglehart and Norris are more interested in the long-term changes within the population as a whole, cohort change and ideological change, and then voting, electoral competition, and the rise of authoritarian populist parties. So here's another description of the values tipping point. We argue, quoting, "We argue that the slow process of value change arising from generational, educational, gender, and urban transformations have deepened cultural cleavages in many Western societies and changed the relative balance between liberalism and conservatism. Older social conservatives have gradually lost their hegemonic status, although remaining a large minority of society." Is this the 40%, by the way? "And a bare majority of the voting public. In addition, traditional social conservatives are clustered disproportionately in declining rural communities based on manufacturing and agriculture, whereas the younger generation have moved away to cities in pursuit of college degrees, job opportunities, leaving behind aged, overwhelmingly white, and less educated populations." Here again, you can see some convergence with Jest, but also with the Richard Florida theory of the talent-based segment of the American population. The other important contribution of this book is their very detailed, and I would say very rigorous, social science analysis of voting outcomes. They're very interested in kind of going from these broad descriptions of ideology and values sweeping through the population over, let's say, a 40-year period of time, and then trying to unpack that in terms of patterns of voter participation and voter outcomes. Again, a quote, "Authoritarian populist forces were decisive for the outcome of the Brexit referendum on the UK's membership in the EU in 2016, igniting anti-immigrant and nativist sentiments and generating a deep financial, political, and constitutional crisis within the UK. In the United States, Donald Trump has overthrown numerous conventions in American politics. His aggressive rejection of political correctness, his belligerent style, and his willingness to engage in culture wars against liberal targets seems to be particularly appealing to older, religious, white men in rural communities, especially social conservatives and xenophobes." Inglehart and Norris reject I use the term knee-jerk, you might say snapshot theories, in which a certain segment of voters reacts impulsively to immigration, shifting racial composition of their cities, or other immediate triggers to right-wing activism. And I am kind of suggesting that both Moody and Jest are taking the short-term proximate causes of right-wing activism, and I think that's what's being criticized here. The cultural backlash theory suggests that there is an iceberg under the surface of the mass of citizens and how they have reacted against changing social and political values of subsequent cohorts and are ready to support radical right parties. Quoting, "The cultural backlash theory suggests that if citizens are choosing whether to vote and which parties to support based on their values, we will find a high level of congruence between authoritarian and socially conservative attitudes and voting for parties that endorse these values in their policy platforms." And by the way, that congruence is something that we've already studied a little bit in discussing the social, psychological, and personality psychology theories of dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarian personality. They refer to wedge issues, and they argue that wedge issues like gun control, abortion rights, and so forth, play a key role in right-wing mobilization of voters. Of course, the biggest wedge issue of all is fear of immigrants. In order to get their supporters to vote and to vote for the right-wing candidate of choice. But the generational differences are very large. Quoting, "A substantial generation gap in voter participation and party choices exists. Younger cohorts are far less likely to vote, a widely observed and consistent pattern across European countries. Voting for authoritarian parties in Europe is significantly stronger among the older generation, as well as among men, the less educated, the religious, and white populations living in rural areas." What they have done here is what I really was kind of wishing we could do for Michigan. They've taken a very segmented approach to the electorate in a number of countries using the Eurobarometer and other tools for measuring values. And they've broken out voting patterns by age, social class, economic situation, and ideology. And they found these very interesting correlations and patterns. They think there's some good news in their book. They are not as gloomy as How Democracies Die. They think that the forces supporting a strengthening of liberal democracy are very, very strong. Quoting from them, "The generational gap in Western societies is likely to heighten the salience of the cultural cleavages in future politics, regardless of possible improvements in the underlying economic conditions or any slowdown in globalization." So they are proposing that the conflict, the ideological conflict and the generational conflict, the urban-rural conflict, the well-educated, less well-educated conflict, that these conflicts will in fact continue to be important. But they believe that the long-term processes of generational change favor the survival of liberal democracy. And those favorable factors include urbanization, widespread economic development, rising educational levels, and a shift to a knowledge economy, favoring autonomy and a creative class. Let's take a look at the graph from VDEM, which is a Swedish nonpartisan research group which measures the level of support for liberal democracy in many countries. And I've referred to this research before, but I've referred to it in the period 2000 or 2005 to 2015, where we see a significant decline. Characteristic of Inglehart and Norris's long-term approach, though, what they notice is that there is a very striking increase in support for and approval of the institutions of liberal democracy from 1900 to the present. And so they would like to look at the period from 2010 to 2015, the down bump, which in a kind of a short-term way looks very alarming. They would like to look at that as a fluctuation, but not a change of trend. They quote, this is a quote from them, "Cass Moody cautions that at least in Western democracies, fears about the impact of populism are largely overblown. And he argues that the rise of populist radical right has had far less serious political consequences than many pessimistic prophecies had long predicted." So this aligns with their own view that the ideological changes and cohort and generational changes they're describing favor the continued health of liberal democracy. They also think that civic culture will survive. By deepening public disenchantment with the workings of political institutions, such as elections, the news media, and the courts, populism can have destabilizing effects on the body politic. Public confidence in democracy seems vulnerable to being undermined by demagogues impugning the impartiality of the courts, alleging widespread electoral fraud, and attacking the role of the free press, as well as potentially heightening social intolerance, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Public skepticism about democracy may tip into cynicism, but it is, again, their view that this is not inevitable. It's not even something that we should expect. We should cautiously pay attention to these attacks on legitimacy, but my reading anyway is that they believe that our civic culture also will survive in a relatively healthy way. And they give several reasons for believing this. So let me again quote from them. Culturally, the overwhelming majority of people believe that democracy is the best form of government, so that any further reforms reflect these values and principles. 2, constitutionally, all the major actors and organs of the state reflect democratic norms and practices. And 3, behaviorally, no significant groups actively seek to overthrow the regime or secede from the state. Now, I would like for you to think a little bit about the past 2 or 3 years and see whether those premises are still true since the publication of this book, Cultural Backlash. And our short-term recent experience certainly does not validate these 3 premises, that the overwhelming majority of people believe in democracy. Polling suggests that Republican voters do not, by majority vote, support democratic voting. Constitutionally, all the major actors and organs of the state reflect democratic norms. Again, not our recent experience. And behaviorally, no significant groups seek to overthrow the regime. Well, January 6th speaks to that. Quoting from them, by deepening public disenchantment with the workings of political institutions, such as elections, the news media, and the courts, populism can have destabilizing effects on the body politic. Public confidence in democracy seems vulnerable to being undermined by demagogues impugning the impartiality of the courts, alleging widespread electoral fraud, and attacking the role of the free press, as well as potentially heightening social intolerance, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. In other words, there are legitimate reasons for worrying that the legitimacy of our basic institutions is being undermined by populist communication strategies, populist themes. But here is their real fundamental basis for optimism. If these age differences reflect generational differences rather than life cycle effects, as the evidence indicates, these differences they're referring to are the generational differences between more liberal, more pluralistic, more social justice-oriented values in opposition to conservative, social dominance-oriented values. If those age differences reflect generational differences, then a gradual transformation of worldviews will tend to emerge over successive decades as older generations with anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim prejudices are replaced by younger birth cohorts holding more cosmopolitan and tolerant attitudes. This is their fundamental basis for optimism about the future. They do think that there are some specific reforms and strategies which should be used within modern liberal democracies. Quoting from them, we need to understand the roots of populist sentiments. And we've seen this view previously in the course. They have the potential to be a force for good in the world when grassroots reform movements help reduce corruption, strengthen responsive governance, expand the issue agenda that are debated and the electoral choices on the ballot, and re-engage participation among groups alienated by mainstream party politics. So option number 1 is try to understand, as Just and Jest tries to understand, some of the legitimate worries, concerns, insecurities of people currently supporting populist solutions. Secondly, reduce economic inequalities. And third, respond to cultural anxieties. This is a question for us in the course. Does this theory, it's a very, very interesting theory, does it suggest a strategy for political change? And I think there are several things we can say about that. The ideological and value conflict, which is described here, social liberal values for younger cohorts, social conservative values for older cohorts, is inherent. It is associated with the kinds of changes in the world, in economy, in politics, in opportunity, which we've seen since 1950. The demography favors further advance of the spread of social liberal values, and therefore, as we've just seen, Inglehart and Norris have qualified optimism. However, we can observe from other things we've read in the course that the long-term perspective does not help if the ship sinks in the short term. In 1930, one might have been very optimistic about the future of Italy, but the fact that Mussolini came to power short-circuited all of those long-term hopes. And therefore, we need political and democratic strategies in the present that maintain support for democracy across all segments of the population. And we need to take this as a high priority. Thank you.